particularly looking at theories that predict that people are going to be motivated to stereotype others. And this is an idea that's been around in psychology and particularly in social psychology almost from the beginning of both disciplines. It's been some of the earliest publications have looked at this basic idea. And the idea that's behind all of them is that people look down upon others, and prejudice is a primary way of doing that in order to feel better about themselves. And we're going to look at a number of different ways that people look down upon on others, but what you can see running through all of this research is that a powerful way that people um, can feel better about themselves, although it's obviously not a good way for people to feel better about themselves, is being prejudiced against others and thinking that they're better than others, looking down on them. We'll start at the beginning in one of the oldest theories in psychology, in one of the earliest publications of a body of research, and it actually became a popular book, semi-popular book anyways, and the theory was called the frustration-aggression hypothesis. And it was an interesting collaboration of a bunch of really different social scientists, not just psychologists. And it brought together people that usually don't come together. This work included people who were psychoanalytic psychologists, so they were Freudian in the way that they thought about the way the mind works, and behavioral psychologists who generally thought that the Freudian way of thinking about the world made no sense at all. Brought together, though it wasn't just that's within psychology, but it brought together anthropologists and sociologists, and it was a broad coalition, interdisciplinary coalition that developed this work that on what became known as the frustration-aggression hypothesis. And the frustration-aggression hypothesis was fairly simple in terms of the idea. And the idea was that when you become frustrated, you will become aggressive. So, what does it mean to be frustrated? Well, what it means to be frustrated is that you have a goal that is blocked. A great example from the book, actually, of this, which I think we might all relate to if we think back to our childhood, of something similar to this, if not this exact scenario, is you can imagine a child who's sitting inside their home and they hear the music of an ice cream truck, and they look out the window of their house or wherever they're living, and they see an ice cream truck sitting outside waiting to sell them ice cream. When they go to the door, hoping to go out to the ice cream truck, the door's locked, and they don't have a way to open the door. That's an example of frustration according to this model. And of course, it makes sense that child is frustrated. They want to get ice cream, but they can't. It's clear what the goal is. The goal is to get ice cream. It's clear what the frustration comes from. That goal is blocked. So the idea of the frustration-aggression hypothesis starts with the idea of what frustration is. Frustration occurs whenever you have a goal and the ability to achieve that goal is blocked. Now, that in and of itself was really very much a behavioral psychology definition of frustration. It's observable, it's something that you can see, and it's behaviors. You see the child looking at the ice cream truck, you see them go to the door, and that goal is blocked. But the twist and what made this a really novel theory was that frustration always leads to aggression. Now, that's a pretty broad and pretty bold claim. If we think about our own life, we're frustrated fairly often. We have goals that we want to fulfill, and we can't fulfill them, and we feel frustrated. Are we always aggressive in response to that? Well, the people who developed the frustration aggression hypothesis, this is where they drew on more psychoanalytic theory, and what they argued is, yes, it's aggressive, but it's not always what you would necessarily see as aggression. You will express that aggression in all kinds of different ways. Maybe it's being passive aggressive, which isn't overt aggressive, but saying something snide to somebody else. Maybe you would take that aggression inward and be angry at yourself, and maybe even hurt yourself for that. For a psychoanalytic orientation, that also is aggression. What's relevant for here became a very clear hypothesis of the frustration aggression hypothesis. And the argument was that when you're frustrated, you could take that frustration not out on what's blocking your goal, not a direct aggression to what's blocking your goal, but you could substitute that aggression and substitute it for somebody else that it's easy to aggress against. And this became one of the fundamental predictions of the frustration aggression hypothesis, is that when you feel frustrated, you will aggress against whoever in the environment you can aggress against and get away with it. Instead of, in this case, the child, in this case, instead of the child beating on the door, which isn't going to do them much good, they're not going to reduce their frustration by beating on the door, trying to get to the ice cream truck. But what they could do, and to be honest, this is the sort of thing my older brother often did to me, you could beat on your younger sibling. And you could take it out on somebody who can't get back at you, somebody within the social structure that actually you can aggress against. So you get frustration, and the aggression isn't taken out on what causes the frustration, but on people in the environment that it's easy to aggress against, where you won't have, where there won't be consequences for aggressing against them. So that was one of the fundamental predictions of frustration aggression hypothesis, is when you feel frustrated, you will aggress against people who there aren't consequences against aggressing them. So in the case of my own childhood, I could think of, if my brother was frustrated, he might aggress against me, but not when my parents were around. And it'd have to be when he could get away with it. So this hypothesis, if you think about it just a little bit, actually says that when people are frustrated, they're likely to aggress against people for whom prejudices already exist, and society allows aggression against those people where prejudices already exist. And this led to one of the primary predictions for the frustration aggression hypothesis. And this prediction came out in the original research that Dollar, Dube, Miller, Maurer, and Sears did and published in their book, and the most famous finding from that book. And what they argued is that when the economic conditions were bad, and in particular, in their case, when cotton prices were lower in the southern U.S., that people would aggress against blacks. And remember, this research was originally done, when they were looking at it, between the late 1800s and the early 1920s. And if you didn't know, one of the horrible facts of American society during that period of time is that blacks, and particularly black men, but blacks in general, were often lynched in the South. and what that means is a group of whites came together, and they would form a bit of a mob. Sometimes it was explicitly the Ku Klux Klan with white robes and hoods and all that sort of thing. Sometimes it wasn't. And what they would do is they would hang the person from a tree, just because they had suspicion of whatever they considered a crime. There were all kinds of justifications for lynchings, none of which were very solid. Often it was that a black man just looked at a white woman. Sometimes it would be allegations of theft. None of this was part of the criminal justice system. It was a vigilante mob. And it happened surprisingly a lot in the southern U.S. during this time period. And what Dollard, Doob, Miller, Maurer, and Sears wanted to look at is what's the relationship between cotton prices and lynchings. And their prediction was that when cotton prices go down, people in the South in general are going to be frustrated. And that seems like a pretty reasonable hypothesis because the economy of the South during this time was very tightly tied to cotton. It was very much still an agricultural society at the time. And if cotton prices went down, the whole economy tanked. There was not a diversified economy in the South. Cotton really drove whether people were doing well or doing poorly economically. So what you saw is a relationship between cotton prices when they went down, the number of lynchings in the South went up. And if you think about this in terms of what we talked about in terms of research methodology, this is a correlation. And remember, when we had a correlation, we have to have three things. First, or to infer causation, we need three things. One of them, the first one, is a correlation. The correlation exists. Cotton prices go down, lynchings go up. Now, you also have to establish time order. Well, time order is fairly easy to establish here because really there's only one direction that makes any sense. Lynchings are not going to affect cotton prices. That doesn't seem very likely at all. On the other hand, cotton prices could affect lynchings, but we have to eliminate other third variables. Well, that's kind of hard to do, but still, and we're not going to do experimental research on this for obvious reasons. But still, this early work made the argument that cotton prices, particularly in the frustration they caused, led to lynchings. And the correlation is high. In the original work from 1989 to about 1930, the correlation was negative 0.65. It's negative because when cotton prices go down, lynching goes up. They go in opposite directions. And that's a very, very strong correlation, bigger than we almost ever see in social science. And so it's a robust relationship. And it still was a bit of a controversial relationship because people wanted to say, well, maybe there's some third variable that's related. And you could think of it as maybe membership in the Ku Klux Klan would be the third variable. It's interesting, though, is that caused by cotton prices, though? If it is, that's not really an alternative third variable causing the other things. It's an intervening cause. It very well may be that decrease in cotton prices increases racism and membership in groups that explicitly target blacks, and that racism and explicitly targeting blacks leads to this awful, illegal, horrific behavior of lynchings. That early research was controversial. It was done very early on when statistics were just being developed in social sciences, and that led other people to look at this a little bit more carefully. And particularly, one of the more modern analyses, which we saw in 1988 by Hepworth and West, is they could look at what's called time series analysis. And time series analysis can set up cotton prices, creating lynchings, and track more closely at the fluctuation in cotton prices to actual lynchings. And it can control for any effect of lynchings on cotton prices. Again, it doesn't make a lot of sense here, but but the more precise time series analysis, which controls for a lot of error and randomness in the data, actually did a good job of demonstrating that correlation really does hold up. It's really not negative 0.65, but Hepworth and West suggested the correlation is still large between cotton prices and lynchings. It's negative 0.43. And one of the things they added, which we'll talk about in the next section, which was very useful, is they offered an alternative mechanism, a way that this happened. And we're going to talk about that in just a second, and that's relative deprivation. And so I'll withhold that until we get to that section, but they actually argued for an intervening cause. Relative deprivation is why cotton prices are related to lynchings is because of relative deprivation. Cotton prices lead to relative deprivation. The relative deprivation leads to lynchings. Okay. That's where the research was for quite a while. Along came in 1998, and notice this is still fairly recent as people are looking at this original data from Dollar, Dube, Miller, Maurer, and Sears. Green, Glaser, and Rich extended this analysis. Notice it ended in 1930, the original data, but they collected additional data and looked at things in the Great Depression. Which of course started in 1929. So they basically had pre-Depression and data and then added the Great Depression to the data. Why is this important? Well, of course, we know the Great Depression is clearly was an economic hardship for almost everyone throughout the country. How did the economic conditions in the Great Depression, how was that related to lynchings? And by adding the extra data and adding an extra variable again, looking at another factor that may influence the data. And in this case, they're looking at something that we call moderation, that the effect holds in some conditions more than in others. And interestingly, what they looked at as a moderator of this relationship between cotton prices and lynchings was political figures' public arguments about blacks. Maybe this is something you totally understand. Maybe given that you were, most people in this class are younger, you wouldn't imagine that this was the case. But throughout the whole time period that they're looking at, which is basically adding the 1930s, the Great Depression in the U.S. is really kind of 1929 to 1941 when the U.S. got involved in World War II. That period is generally what we call the Great Depression, and as they looked at that, what affected the relationship between cotton prices and lynchings, made it weak or made it strong, was the political statements of white politicians. Well, all the politicians were white at this time in the South. There were no thought. Blacks were generally denied the right to vote in the South during this period of time. And there certainly were no black politicians during this time. Were the white politicians' arguments about blacks and whether they blamed blacks for the economic conditions. Now, this is, of course, preposterous that blacks were responsible for the Great Depression or that blacks were responsible for fluctuations in cotton prices. But that didn't stop the very racist ideology of politicians labeling the cause for this, labeling the cause of the economic conditions on blacks. And we saw that racist statements by political figures, the relationship between cotton prices and lynching is very strong when there are recent and common racist statements by political figures suggesting that blacks are the cause of the economic conditions. When those statements are much less common and they're not being made, and you can look at areas of the countries because you can track lynchings to places where the political figures are, there were explicitly racist politicians and less racist politicians, very racist and less racist politicians. If you look where the less racist politicians were, who weren't blaming blacks for the economic conditions, what you saw is that correlation between cotton prices and lynchings is smaller. I think all of that fits with the frustration aggression hypothesis. If you think about it, if you blame blacks for the economic conditions, it's actually almost not a substitution of blacks for what's blocking it. You come to believe that blacks actually are creating the economic conditions. So you're aggressing against the source in your own mind of the of your economic frustrations. You're also, and this is probably, I would argue, is more important, it's also ultimately very clear in those regions where blacks are being blamed for the economic conditions that you have impunity to harm blacks. And lynchings are, of course, the pinnacle of harming blacks, but you have the aggression against blacks in those communities is explicitly allowed. You have impunity for those actions. And by the way, during the whole period of the Dollar, Dube, Miller, Mauer, and Sears, and virtually not until the civil rights movements in the 60s, there were no whites who were ever convicted of killing any blacks. It just didn't happen in the South. There was impunity for these actions, which sets up the conditions for this relationship to actually exist. It is moderated. The relationship between cotton prices and lynchings is stronger when political figures are explicitly racist. It's weaker when that explicit racism is not perpetuated. Well, let's pause for just a second and think about whether this still applies in modern day society. Are there any political figures that blame economic conditions on minorities in the current situation? I'll leave you to answer that as you think about the current political situation. I think it could be argued that sometimes those conditions exist. And the same hypothesis could be investigated today. Is aggression, assault, police brutality, is that going to be more common in areas where political figures, and in times when political figures blame economic conditions on minorities? The frustration aggression hypothesis would suggest that it will be. And they will suggest that that is one way that prejudice could serve a motivational function, especially amongst those who have greatest economic hardship. All right. Now, I mentioned when I was talking about Hepworth and West that they talked about one particular theory that they thought played a role and was part of the intervening cause, not a third variable causing both economic depression and lynchings, but they thought could be an intervening cause, in the frustration aggression hypothesis. And it's part of a general theory that's been around at least since the 1950s. And really in sociology, it's been around longer. And the theory is called relative deprivation. And the idea is one reason that we look down upon others when things are bad for us is it allows us to feel better about ourselves because at least we're not in the situation that other people are in. The classic work on this was done by Merton in 1957. It was published in 57, but the analysis was actually of soldiers in World War II. And what he looked at, and what the Department of Defense did in World War II, is they surveyed soldiers a lot to see kind of how they were feeling about being soldiers. World War II is beyond most of our memories at this time, but World War II was a very different war than anything that's happened since. One of the things about World War II is there were a lot of people who volunteered. Um, but those weren't the only people in World War II. There was a large draft in World War II. A lot of people were drafted and assigned to fight in World War II. The other thing about World War II that isn't like any of the wars that have happened since in the US is it was really, really clear to most people, and still is really, really clear to most people, why that war had to be fought. Um, there was an evil dictator in Adolf Hitler. Allowing Adolf Hitler to take all of Europe, which he certainly wanted, and more than that, seemed like a fight that many, many people thought was very, very worthy of doing. Could we let Hitler be a threat to potentially the whole world? So there was a very clear bad guy who needed to be fought in World War II. There was also Japan, which as a country attacked the U.S. And if you don't know the history of World War II, U.S. got into World War II when the Japanese attacked the naval fleet, which the U.S. kind of stupidly had kept half of its fleet in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And the U.S., it was a devastating attack. Many, many people died. So the U.S. was fighting on one in Europe with Hitler, who was obvious why you wanted to fight him, and they were fighting in the Pacific, the Japanese, who had attacked the U.S. That's a very different war than anything that's ever been fought since. But despite that, soldiers really hated being in the war. War's awful. You can die. And the government wanted to figure out what affects how soldiers feel about fighting in the war. On one hand, it seemed reasonable that, and it was widely expressed, that people might not feel so bad. They would feel like they're doing something noble in fighting this war, defending the country, if they're in the Pacific, fighting, Nazis and the evil of Hitler, if they're fighting in Europe. So it felt like it could be a noble war. Maybe they don't feel so bad about it. On the other hand, maybe they absolutely, hate being in war because it kind of sucks. You really don't have very good treatment and your life is in danger all the time. Seems pretty reasonable. You might hate being in World War II. So Merton actually looked at how soldiers were thinking about their life as soldiers. How satisfied were they with being a soldier? And he found these odd effects that still surprise people. And he really just compared three groups of soldiers thinking, and he wasn't looking at the Pacific so much, really let's focus on Europe. He compared soldiers who were stationed in the U.S. Soldiers who were stationed in the U.S., they know they might go to Europe at some time, but but for now, they're stationed in the U.S., they're held back as reserves. To soldiers in England, of course, are much safer than those who are fighting in Europe, but it's not completely safe after all. If you're in England, you still might get bombed. If you know about World War II, England was bombed pretty extensively, but by and large, you're fairly safe in England. Certainly compared to those who were fighting on the continent in Europe, which is the third group he talked to, and you're getting shot at all the time. Now, not surprisingly, those soldiers who are actually sometimes literally in the trenches, sometimes just regularly fighting the Germans, they were quite unhappy. they had their friends die at an alarming rate. And they had horrible conditions, were being shot at, didn't always have food. It was tough. They weren't very happy. Um, Interestingly, though, the other two groups, the findings on how happy they were completely surprising to many people, and still are, I think, in some ways, to most people. It turns out when we look at soldiers stationed at home in the US and soldiers stationed in England, the happiest group of these three is soldiers stationed in England. And soldiers stationed back home in the US, held in reserve, are actually about as unhappy as soldiers on the front. Now, how could that possibly be? How could they be upset, when they're stationed at home? And the answer that Merton had was relative deprivation. And what he argued is that soldiers stationed back home, who do they compare themselves to? They compare themselves not to soldiers on the front, not to soldiers even in England. They compare themselves to civilians. And, a life in an army barracks with really crappy food and knowing that you may at any point get shipped over to your death isn't nearly as good as a regular civilian life. And as they compare themselves to civilians, they feel relatively deprived. On the other hand, what do soldiers in England compare themselves to? Well, they're part of the army, and who they're comparing themselves to are the other people in the army that are stationed on the front and getting shot at. They might well, it's not great being here in England, but at least I'm not on the front, and at least I'm not going to die immediately, or not a great chance of dying immediately. I feel kind of fortunate that I get to be here in England and not over there on the continent where there are people shooting at me. So actually, the group that was the happiest, who felt the best about their situation, were the soldiers in England, not the soldiers back home. The soldiers back home felt almost as bad, really, really close to as bad about their situation as the soldiers on the front who were getting shot at. That's the classic relative deprivation finding. Now, Hepworth and West argued that a similar thing was related to the frustration-aggression hypothesis. And what they argued is that one of the things that held down the frustration-aggression hypothesis is the extent to which whites in the South compared themselves to blacks. If whites were in a situation in which they compared themselves to blacks, it actually was like soldiers in England. They're relatively well off. But one of the things about, they argued, cotton prices dropping is it changed the interaction between whites and blacks, such that there was less contact, less interaction between whites and blacks, and less feelings of relative deprivation. And whenever there was lots of contact, lots of interactions between whites and blacks, that suppressed the correlation between cotton prices and lynchings. It's an interesting hypothesis that they had, and it may explain why they found in the time series a weaker relationship. It doesn't do away with the relationship, but it does suggest both the Merton findings and this Hepworth and West reinterpretation of the frustration, aggression, cotton prices, and lynchings data suggest that one of the functions that people are looking for when they feel threatened, when things aren't going well, you're in the army, and you may go to war, economic conditions are terrible, you feel better when you can look down upon others. So in England, you get to look down upon, you get to look down upon those soldiers in the continent and realize, woo, I'm not one of them. And those sorts of comparisons with other people are more fully developed in a classic social psychological theory called downward social comparison. Now, downward social comparison was developed in the 1950s by Leon Festinger, and it mostly focused on how do we compare with others to understand what our abilities are and to understand what our attitudes are. But it took a while for people to realize into the 1980s, and particularly Wills had a paper in 1981 that argued that social comparisons serve another function. Social comparisons allow us to look down upon others in order to feel better about ourselves. And in some ways, it's really just an extension of the relative deprivation findings, but it makes it it allows you to look down more generally rather than in any specific way at other people's. And Wills argued in this paper, quite compellingly, providing a lot of data, that when we feel threatened, we're more likely to be prejudiced, more likely to look down upon others, and those feelings of looking down upon others helps us feel better about ourselves. May not be the preferred, in fact, it's almost always not the preferred way to feel better about yourself, but it is a powerful mechanism to feel better about yourself by looking down upon other people's. Now, this idea of downward social comparison as a way to feel better about yourself as a motivating factor is really one of the more modern takes on why looking down upon others would let you feel better about yourself. We'll talk about some more modern studies in just a little bit, but this downward social comparison model is one that I want you to understand and see that it's behind much of the research that were the specific studies we're going to talk about later. But I do want you to see that it can have a useful function as well, these sorts of downward social comparisons in order to feel better about themselves. And I have particularly in mind a study by Wood, Taylor, and Lichtman, which was about downward social comparison and how downward social comparisons could be beneficial to women suffering from breast cancer. What they did in this study is they went to actual clinics where women were diagnosed with breast cancer, and they looked at how they coped with their treatment and how they were actually doing. And one of the primary things they found when they followed these women over a year is that a huge percentage, upwards of 80% of them, did some sort of downward social comparison in an effort to cope with the disease they were suffering. And what I want you to see here is that downward social comparison doesn't have to be the ugly, prejudicial kind. It can be a reasonable strategy, and whether we see downward social comparison as good or bad depends on what the target of that downward social comparison is and how you interact with them. So what Wood, Taylor, and Lichtman showed is that almost all women, regardless of how serious the disease was and regardless of whether it really was terminal or not, made a downward social comparison. So women who had early stages and had lumpectomy, it was easy for them to say, well, this isn't great. I don't like having the surgery. It's a huge disruption of my life. I'm worried, but at least I do not have the condition of most of the women in this clinic who caught the disease much later, much more likely to die from it, and have had much more serious disruptions and much more drastic surgery. But what was that isn't so surprising, but what was super compelling about the research is they looked at the women who were in the worst conditions. Women who had to have a double mastectomy. They had stage 4, the most severe spread of the cancer. It was definitely terminal, and they knew that it was very unlikely that they would live from this disease. Almost all of those women still were able to make downward social comparisons. They were able to make those downward social comparisons even when the person to compare themselves with didn't exist. And quite often it would go with, I know this is terrible. I know that I've had, all these surgeries to try and deal with the cancer and the spread of it. But at least I'm not, at least in my case, I have a supportive husband. I have a supportive family. My kids have been wonderful. I have a meaningful job. Throw in whatever works for the person, and they imagine somebody else in their situation who doesn't have that. So even if they have to imagine the downward social comparison, almost all women in in that really horrible situation that they're in developed a downward social comparison. I think it's important to keep in mind as we understand and we're thinking about the really ugly side of downward social comparison as a way to feel better about oneself. It's not intrinsically a wrong strategy. I think the studies of breast cancer show how it can be functional for people to think of somebody else who's in a worse situation as a way to feel better about yourself. Now, if you derogate those people, if you discriminate against them, if you lynch them, well, that's a really horrible strategy. But the very act of appreciating that you've had things better off than some other people, even when you've had things pretty terrible, is not in and of itself an intrinsic problem. Where it becomes a problem is when that downward social comparison leads to horrible actions. That leads me to talk about another important theory. Actually, Leon Festinger had two hugely important theories in social psychology in the 1950s. Downward social comparison was one of them. The more famous of his two theories, however, though, is cognitive dissonance theory. Now, cognitive dissonance theory argues that whenever you have two thoughts that are psychologically inconsistent, you either have to change whichever thought's easier to change, or you need a third thought to reconcile the inconsistency between the thoughts. Now, how does this basic theory relate to prejudice? Well, if you think about prejudice as it develops, it almost always, although not quite always, but very often prejudice develops in situations where one group has power over another group and exploits them. If we think of the case of the U.S., historically, this was whites having power over blacks and literally enslaving them. Now, if you look at that history of whites enslaving blacks, whites mistreated blacks horribly. Now, if you think about that situation, it is a situation of cognitive dissonance. If you are whites in the South and you're mistreating blacks, not giving them opportunities, beating them, mistreating them in numerous different ways, that's inconsistent with basically any cognition that I'm a good and decent person. It's hard there is psychological inconsistency. I'm a good and decent person, and I spit on, mistreat, whip, beat, lynch other people. Those thoughts are really highly psychologically inconsistent. Now, what you do about it? Well, most people really are very reluctant to give up the idea that I'm a good and decent person. And you really can't take back those horrible actions you did either. So cognitive dissonance theory actually predicts that you need a third cognition to resolve it. And what's common in these situations when a powerful group mistreats a less powerful group is the thought that reconciles it is somehow they deserve it. That group is not good in whatever ways helps resolve that inconsistency. And the idea is cognitive dissonance theory predicts that whenever a powerful group exploits a less powerful group, which happens commonly, the powerful group develop prejudicial, negative, horrible prejudicial views of the less powerful group. and that's going to happen whenever you have power differentials and the powerful group exploits the less powerful group. Negative, unfair, prejudicial evaluations of the less powerful group will develop. And so if we look at the history of race in the U.S., cognitive dissonance theory suggests that it is the exploitation of blacks in slavery that leads to the prejudicial views. And those prejudicial views, if we circle it into the frustration aggression hypothesis, allow the expression of frustration against blacks to be in the horrible, severe form of beatings and lynchings. And I think we can argue that even to modern day society, when we think about the structure of society, that the exploitation by the powerful over the less powerful still needs that third cognition to justify it. And that is a powerful explanation of why prejudices exist. All right. This is similar to, although an expansion of it is in social identity theory. Social identity, all the theories we've been talking about so far, frustration, aggression, relative deprivation, downward social comparison, cognitive dissonance, are individual theories. Social identity theory adds another layer to this prediction, saying for some people who identify with their groups, it's not just a matter of defending the self, it can also be a matter of defending the group. I want to see my group as better than other groups. My group really matters to how I think about myself, so one way I can feel better about myself is saying my group is better than the other group. And when we look at many examples of prejudices, there's claims that one group is superior to another group. Those claims of group superiority over other groups really are better explained by a social identity theory where people are identified with their group, and saying their group is better allows them to feel better about themselves. It's a similar mechanism, but all the mechanisms we've been talking about have been individual. This is a group-based mechanism. And if it's important for you that your group is seen positively, then derogating other groups will be a clear way for you to maintain that view of your groups. So all these theories predict we adopt goals to be prejudiced. The goal can be to deal with your frustration by aggressing against this group. The goal can be to understand my situation and see it as better than it actually is for relative deprivation. The goal can be directly to look down upon others so that I feel better about myself, downward social comparison. And the goal can be to justify the fact that I've been in power and I've exploited the people who have been in power. Or the goal can be to see my group as better than another group. All of these theories come together and predict that prejudice will be motivated. It will be a goal for people to be prejudiced, and it ultimately, all of them, this prejudice serves a sense of feeling better about the self. So the argument is here that people want to be prejudiced against others in order to feel better about themselves, because it lets them deal with their frustration, it lets them feel better about the bad situation they're in, it lets them look down upon others and see themselves as superior, it reduces the guilt and bad feelings they have because being in power they've exploited others, or it lets their group seem better than other groups. All of those are motivations to be prejudiced. So in the research I want to talk about is when people feel threatened, we want to see whether and that's the general idea, when people feel threatened, frustrated, whatever you want to call it, when they feel threatened, they will be more likely to be prejudiced. So I want to talk about really just 3 studies from the late 1990s, although even more modern studies have done. I think these really illustrate that quite well. So I'm going to start out with a study from Sinclair and Kunda. And what they did was a fairly simple study. They did this study at a university, actually in Canada, where there's a huge co-op program. 2/3 of the students are on this co-op program, and the way the co-op program works is your first year university is the same as any other place, but starting in the summer after your first year, the co-op program gives you a job as closely related to what you might want to do in the future as possible, and it actually pays quite well. And then after that summer, you go back to school in the fall, but then in the winter, spring, the next term, you go back to a job. And you do every other term, you work, and every other term you go to school. It's a great way to pay for school because the co-op jobs are related to what you're learning in school, and you get pretty good money for doing it. So a bunch of students do it. It gets you job experience, and it gets you good money to help pay for school. It's a great program, but one of the big troubles with this is they have to figure out who goes to what job. So there's this huge interviewing process. So they took advantage of this, and this study, they told students who came in for the study that this study was about trying to improve the co-op interviewing process. So they were studying how that interviewing happens, and they were trying to make the co-op process better. So when people came in, they were interviewed for a supposed co-op job, one that they might actually like, but they knew it wasn't really going to determine their job, but they thought this was done by the co-op office, and it was a real manager from a company who the companies want to improve the process to, who was interviewing them. Now, this manager was either white or black. And as you might guess, they gave this interview, and the way they did it is it was old enough that they swapped videotapes back and forth. So their videotape was interviewed. That supposedly went to the manager, who was then going to provide them feedback. They had to wait while the manager watched the videotape, and then they got a videotape from the manager. The videotape was the same to everybody, and the manager says vague things. Well, I really don't think they have that much experience. They seemed a little nervous. I thought their answers could have been a lot sharper. I actually don't think this is a very good candidate for our firm. So that was the negative feedback condition. In the positive feedback condition, the manager says, I really like this interview. The person seemed really on the ball. I liked what they've studied. They seem to be quick in their responses to most questions. I really think they'd be a terrific candidate. Notice it's very general feedback, and it totally worked. Everybody believed the negative, or almost everybody believed the positive and negative feedback. But then what they looked at was, after positive or negative feedback from this white or black manager, and the feedback's exactly the same whether the manager's white or black, they had people fill in stereotypic word completions. They thought it was a totally different study. They just said, okay, here's a bunch of words, and this was part of when this was after they got the feedback. They thought this was part of a totally different study while they were kind of waiting for further results from the manager. And there were just blanks indicating where letters would be, and one of them was blank blank ACK. Now you could fill that in as black. You could fill it in as slack or stack or knack, K-N-A-C-K. There's a snack. You could fill it in with a whole bunch of things, but what they were looking for is, did they fill it in with black? And then you had blank AZY, did you fill it in with lazy? But you could fill it in with hazy instead. And CR blank blank blank, you could fill that in with crust. You could fill it in with a lot of things, but did they fill it in with crime? So were these word completions stereotypic? How many did they typically have from a list of about 5? And did the stereotypic completions go up when the manager was black and they received negative feedback? And that's exactly what they found. When you have feedback and it's positive, there's actually less stereotypic completions about the black manager. When the feedback is negative, there's actually more stereotypic completions about the black manager. And you could argue even that the positive stereotyping is a bit stereotypic, because when you get positive feedback from this black manager, you might not want to think of them as black. If you view blacks negatively. After all, they said positive things. I want to think of them as competent. Notice between the positive and negative feedback, for whites, there's no difference in stereotypic completions, which makes perfect sense, because the white manager shouldn't have anything to do with stereotypes about blacks. After those stereotypic word completions, the last thing they did is they rated the manager's competency. How good is this manager at interviewing people? Thinking that's part of the full everybody evaluating one another and improving the co-op program. So the managers evaluate the co-op students evaluate the interviewer. And what we find in that is, again, a very strong finding. First of all, everybody thinks the manager is more competent when he, and it was always men, he gives them positive feedback than when he gives them negative feedback. But even bigger than that effect, when he is black and he gives them negative feedback, he's seen as a much more incompetent manager. So when this black manager tells them, well, I don't think they're very good, I don't like the way they answered the question, they're kind of vague, doesn't seem to have much experience, the black manager, when he gave them that negative feedback, they totally thought he was incompetent, much more so than when he was white. Pretty clearly demonstrating stereotyping. And prejudice in this case. And not surprisingly, the word stem completions in these studies are a bit related to the evaluations of the manager. Okay, wanting to take this a little bit further, Sinclair and Kunda really wanted to argue that what happens is when you see somebody, a black in this case, if you have these prejudice evaluations that are covering your judgment, when you get positive feedback, you're not going to want to see them as black. And when you get negative feedback, you're going to want to see them as black. And how do they demonstrate that? Well, they changed the procedure just a tiny little bit. Rather than have it be a manager, they said, we're wondering whether other professional people could do a better job than the managers who typically do the interviews in these co-ops. So we recruited for this particular study doctors. We thought doctors are capable people. They don't do a lot of this type of hiring, but would they be better or worse than the managers? So now it's exactly the same procedure. People are being interviewed for a co-op job, but rather than a manager, it's a doctor. And what they were interested in is when these people got feedback that was positive, would they see the black doctor as a doctor and not so much as black? And when they get negative feedback, would they see him as black but not as a doctor? And that's what they were going for in this particular study by having two stereotypes that they could look at, a doctor and racial stereotypes, whether stereotypes about blacks. They could actually see whether see how people responded to this negative feedback. So just like it's exactly the same procedure, otherwise actually it's the same videotapes that they're seeing in this particular study. They're just told he's a doctor, and he either gives them, and he's either white or black, and he either gives them positive or negative feedback. Control participants, they added, thought they would receive the feedback later, because this lets us look at general activation of the doctor stereotype and the black stereotype, independent of any feedback independent from any feedback. Now, they did the activation of the stereotype in a slightly better way. Rather than the word stem completions, they just looked at how fast people responded to words associated with the stereotypes. And some of the words that they did were gang, rap, violent for blacks, and hospital, health, medical for doctor. Now, the idea is if you're very fast to a word, and so it's the opposite of the stem completions. You did more completions if it was activated, but you'll actually be faster to words if a concept is activated in your mind. So that's what they're looking at. So what we're going to look at is how fast they identified each of those things as a word, not anything else, just whether it was a word or not. And how is that affected by whether the doctor gave them positive feedback or negative feedback, and whether he was black or not. And let's first look at the doctor stereotypes. What we find is when they get positive feedback from a black doctor, they're super fast to the doctor stereotypic words. They're seeing the black doctor as a doctor. They're super fast to the doctor words, and they're really slow to the black words. So this guy, I'm sorry, we'll get to that in just a second, but they're super fast. They're seeing, when they get positive feedback from their black doctor, they are seeing him as a doctor. But when they get negative feedback from the black doctor, they're not seeing him as a doctor. They're super slow. It's hard for them to think about doctor stuff when this black doctor just gave them negative feedback. When we look at the stereotypic findings, we get absolutely the opposite. When the black doctor gives them positive feedback, they're not thinking of him as black. They're slow to identify black words. So if we look at the positive feedback, they're fast to identify him as a doctor, slow to identify him as black. They're thinking, this really does indicate they're thinking him as a doctor and not black. In contrast, when they get negative feedback from the black doctor, they're not thinking about him as a doctor. They're slow to identify doctor words, and they're fast to identify black words. They're thinking about him as black and not a doctor. None of these things happen at all, really, when it's a white doctor. There's no impact on how they're thinking about him as a doctor. No impact in how they're thinking about the black stereotype. So together, these studies really suggest that when people are threatened by somebody who gives them feedback, that activates the black stereotype if he's black. And that leads to harsh evaluation of him in terms of his competence. Not only are they thinking about him as black, they're not thinking about him in other ways that would be further threatening, like that he's a doctor and that he's capable and all those kinds of things. So what this suggests is when people are threatened, in order to feel better about themselves, they derogate the person who threatened them, and they don't even think about them in positive ways. Instead, they think about them solely in terms of the stereotype. Okay. Now, the threat here, though, in the Kunda and Sinclair studies, is always caused by the person who is always caused by the person who's giving them feedback. We could imagine, though, and the problem of motivated stereotyping, people being motivated to stereotype other people, is a lot worse if it doesn't just happen when somebody from that group gives you negative feedback and threatens you, if the threat is more general. And so the study I'm going to end with today is a study that I did with one of my colleagues, Steve Fine. And we did this study at that school up north. Michigan. And we were both graduate students at Michigan at the time. And this is a study, and it's important to know that it's at Michigan for a couple of reasons. First of all, the stereotype that we looked at is one that's not widely known, but was widely known and discussed in the newspaper, the Michigan Daily at the time. That's actually one of the reasons we decided. They were talking about what they called the Jap stereotype. And by Jap stereotype, it wasn't anything about people from Japan. It meant the Jewish American princess stereotype. And it was, there were several articles, as Steve and I read the student newspaper, where they talked about Japs, and we were just shocked that they would talk about these sorts of stereotypes in the student newspaper, and it seemed to just be common knowledge that that stereotype exists, and people didn't seem to think there were any problems with it. I think there actually are huge problems with the stereotypes. It contains elements of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism being prejudice against people who are Jewish, and it contains elements of misogyny. Misogyny means dislike and prejudice against women. Has both elements to it. The stereotype is basically that Jewish American princesses are vain, superficial, they don't take anything seriously, all they want is money and to buy things, and they care about status symbols. They're probably looking for a husband rather than being a serious student. Those are kind of the general things that are considered as part of the stereotype. It's actually kind of nasty and undermining. Why would it develop at Michigan? Well, one of the reasons is that, this is not generally known as well, a third of the students at Michigan are Jewish. Part of that is their out-of-state students are largely from New York. And if you didn't know this, New York has a higher percentage of Jewish people than most places in the country, and that draw brings more Jewish people to the University of Michigan. And just historically, the University of Michigan has been a school that has brought in and welcomed a lot of Jewish students. So much so, and this is one of the things we took advantages of in the studies, that there's at least one, well, there's actually two sororities on campus where all of the members of the sorority have been and always been Jewish students. Now, to show that there's, the welcoming is not completely there, there are also several sororities on campus that have never had a Jewish member. So it's not as if these issues of anti-Semitism aren't something that's relevant at Michigan. They definitely are. So we wanted to look at this Jewish American princess stereotype and see if we could observe it and test these ideas that it's threats to how you're feeling about yourself that lead to stereotyping. So what we did in this study is we brought in students from intro psych, and we had them take a very hard intelligence test. And that was supposed to be study one that they were going to do in and of itself. They take this hard intelligence test. We either give them really pretty negative feedback, they're in the 47th percentile, or we give them quite positive feedback, they're in the 91st percentile. After taking that test, they took a state self-esteem scale. And this just asks how you're feeling about yourself right now, including about how you performed lately. And not surprisingly, on the state self-esteem scale as a whole, but particularly on the performance subscale of that, people who got positive feedback are feeling better about their performance lately than people who got negative feedback. So really, we threaten them in a way that they explicitly understood. They feel worse about themselves and how they've been performing lately. Now they go on to what they think is a totally different study, and they're asked to evaluate a woman, and they're playing the role of a personnel manager in this evaluation. So the first thing that happens is they get an application for this woman, and there are cues in the application that either she's Jewish or she's not. We actually tried to make it look like she was Italian, but our participants at Michigan just thought she was white. They didn't recognize the cues that she was Italian, so one of the cues was her name. Her name was either Julie Goldberg, which is a name that would tend to indicate she's Jewish, or her name was Maria de Agostino, which we thought would indicate she was Italian. They didn't quite pick up on that. There was also a picture of her. It's the same woman in the picture either time, but in one picture, she's wearing her hair up in a hair clip that at that time at the University of Michigan, I kid you not, students generally called it a Jap clip for Jewish American princess. So again, to indicate that she's probably Jewish. She's also wearing a necklace in the picture when she's being portrayed as Jewish. She's wearing a Star of David. When she's being portrayed as Italian or ends up being white, she's wearing a cross. Also, as you're going through the application, everything's the same, except she did service work when she's portrayed as Jewish at Hillel Foundation, which is a Jewish social service organization, or she did service work at Catholic Social Services, obviously, a Catholic, non-Jewish social service agency. And then lastly, she was part of a sorority that pretty much everybody knew on campus was 100% Jewish, or she was part of a sorority that never had Jewish members. So those were the clues. Everything else about the application is the same. They watch a videotape of her being interviewed for this. She's actually a kind of meh candidate. She's not that good. It's probably quite a reach for her to be applying for this job as a personnel manager. She has very little experience. She doesn't do that well in the interview. Not horrible, but just kind of meh. Then they evaluated her for the job and rated her personality. And then they took a second self-esteem scale. So the question is, did they rate her negatively when she was Jewish after they had been threatened, but not when they hadn't been threatened? And did rating her negatively increase their state self-esteem? And if we look at the answer to that question, first of all, when we get positive feedback, it made no difference whether she was Julie or Maria. They rated her exactly the same, which makes sense. All the information was the same. But after they had received negative feedback, they rated her much more negatively when she was Jewish than when she was Italian. And that's true both for the job rating and for her personality. And now let's look at what that did to their self-esteem. Not surprisingly, after that initial threat, everybody recovers. Even in the positive feedback condition, their self-esteem goes up a little bit from going through this process. Not sure exactly why. That's probably the test is somewhat threatening to everyone. And doing this evaluation process allows everybody to recover their state self-esteem a bit. Even if you get great feedback, the test was still really hard and was probably a little bit threatening. But what happens after negative feedback? Their state self-esteem goes way up after they derogate, after they say really negative things about Julie, the Jewish candidate. After they rate her negatively, their state self-esteem returns. Notice here the threat is general. It has nothing to do with Julie. Julie didn't threaten them like we saw in the Kundin and Sinclair studies. The threat was from the test that they actually took. And despite that, they're motivated to stereotype her. And that motivation really is about feeling better about themselves. When they the more they were threatened, the more they stereotyped her. I'm not showing you all those results, but it's actually there if you want to read the paper. The more they threatened her, when they get negative feedback, the more threatened they felt about that feedback, the more they stereotype Julie, not Maria, but the more they stereotype Julie, and the more they stereotype Julie, the better they felt about themselves. This research together, I think, really turns the rock over on the ugly side, so you can see the ugly side of prejudice and stereotyping. We're talking about really dramatic behaviors here in which people are motivated to stereotype other people. One reason that people want to stereotype other people and be prejudiced against other people, discriminate, hurt, beat, lynch other people, this research suggests, is in order to feel better about themselves. The threat can come in all kinds of diverse forms. It can come just when you get bad feedback on a test. It can come because that person evaluates you negatively. It can come because the economic conditions suck. It can come because you, as a powerful person, exploited less powerful people. There will be that motivation to stereotype others. And that is one of, I would like to argue, is the fundamental point today why people stereotype others. It's a way to look down upon them, and looking down on them allows them to feel better about themselves. That's it for today, and I hope you have a good weekend if you listen to the lecture today, or have a good week, and thank you for taking the time to listen to the lecture.